of Israel's leaders, which some people seem to think somehow could be dismissed. It was also because, of course, what the Israel Defense Force was doing to Gaza right from the start was very clearly something completely out of the ordinary. It wasn't, of course, the first time in which Israel had attacked and destroyed parts of Gaza. And I certainly was judging this question from the basis of knowing, of course, what Israel had done to Gaza in 4 or 5 occasions over the previous 15 years. So we're very well aware of the ability and the willingness of Israel to engage in very destructive violence in Gaza and to kill civilians in a wanton way. But it was clear in October 2023 that what was happening now was a new stage, a very radical new stage in this process. That because of the nature of the humiliation inflicted on Israel and on its leaders, a humiliation which echoed other humiliations of political leaders, which always lead to enormous overreactions. And because of the historic pattern in which we can see from the history of colonial conquest that when the colonized use violence against the colonizers, there is always a big overreaction. So when there are massacres of the colonizers, there are usually full-scale genocides or very large massacres of the colonized. And this pattern, all of this made me think that what we were going to see, or what we were seeing even in the first 24 hours, was the beginnings of a genocide. And this was confirmed really by the enormous bombardment which Israel undertook in the first weeks. It was quite clear that they were attempting to destroy Gaza in total, in general, not just a little bit here or a little bit there, or one neighborhood here, one neighborhood there. They were attempting to destroy the whole place, and they were immediately forcing the people of Gaza out of their homes and into smaller and smaller parts of the territory. So it was evident that we were seeing not just war crimes, not even just crimes against humanity, but the intentional destruction of Palestinian society in Gaza. And that is why I call it a genocide, because genocide is the intentional destruction of a group or a community, a society. And that is what we were seeing even in October 2023 and what we have seen in the subsequent 20 months. The denial of this genocide was almost universal. As we know, Western political leaders all supported Israel in the first months, and nearly all of them still do today. Media focused on Hamas crimes, even when the crimes of Israel were multiplying Hamas crimes many times over. And for virtually 18 months, there was no space for the argument that Israel was committing genocide. Even in the liberal press, there was an enormous reluctance even to allow opinion columnists to write in those terms, let alone to pronounce editorially on it. And there was a systematic pattern of denial. And I take my understanding of denial of genocide from the great sociologist Stan Cohen, who was a South African Jewish sociologist who went and worked in Israel in the 1980s and 90s and came back to formulate his theory of the fundamental types of denial of atrocities and genocide. And he said that there were 3 types, and the first was literal denial, which I think everybody is familiar with. And in this case, we had enormous amounts of literal denial. The Western media were denying time after time that the types of atrocity which were being reported by citizen journalists were actually occurring. But more than that, we had what Stan Cohen calls interpretive denial, where the events are twisted out of shape. And of course, there were two main frames, really, for this denial. One was the frame of anti-Semitism, the argument that if anyone makes a fundamental accusation against Israel, it must be the product of anti-Semitism. And that argument held enormous sway in the first year or so of this genocide. And of course, it had been prepared by 2 decades of, or even more in fact, but particularly in the previous 2 decades, with the concentration of Israel and pro-Israeli advocates on forming this idea that anti-Semitism was the fundamental evil, the fundamental form of racism, not even really a form of racism, worse than racism, and that any criticism of Israel was equivalent to anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism were the same thing. And we had the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which was spread throughout Western institutions and adopted almost universally by governments, universities, and all sorts of organizations. The second frame, though, was the frame of war, the idea that somehow, if Israel was fighting a war against Hamas, it could not be committing a genocide. Although it was obvious, I think, to anybody who looked at what was happening to the civilian population in Gaza, that what was happening was a genocide perpetrated in the guise of war, through the methods of war. Every 2,000-pound bomb that dropped on a neighborhood in Gaza didn't just destroy maybe 1 or 2 Hamas militants, it destroyed, killed dozens, scores, maybe even hundreds of Palestinian civilians. So it was clear that Israel was using its war to destroy Gaza as a society, as a home for 2 million Palestinians. And there was, in the way in which this war was understood in Western media, especially, and by Western politicians, there was what Francesca Albanese calls humanitarian camouflage, the idea that the laws of war in some way were being used by Israel for reasons opposite to their original purpose. So what kind of genocide is this in Gaza? I think back, because, I mean, obviously this isn't the total mass murder of every single person in Gaza. It isn't, so far, the expulsion from the territory. Well, that's clearly what Israeli leaders would like to do, and that is what Trump has joined them in. But so far, it has really been the crippling of Gazan society and the crippling of the people, I think, within it. That seems to me to be what it amounts to. And I think in terms of the founder of the idea of genocide, Raphael Lemkin, who talked about genocide as either the destruction or the crippling of a society. And the way in which he talked about genocide that the Nazis committed in the 1940s has very much echoes in the genocide that we see today in Gaza. So Lemkin talked about the extreme weakening of the conditions of life so that, quote, a daily fight literally for bread and for physical survival would handicap thinking in both general and national terms. So he was linking really the way in which the physical conditions of the people were diminished to the point of virtually nothing, and when they were fighting for bread and being shot down when they were getting it, with the crippling of the idea of the possibility of a national movement and national solutions to their problems. And this seems to me to very much be echoed in what we see today. The genocide that we see today is being committed not just by the Israeli state and the Israeli army. It seems to me there is a larger perpetrator block. This seems to be a useful idea to think about the perpetrators and the way they are linked together, because it isn't just these most obvious core actors. In some ways, this is what we could call a democratic genocide, carried out with the active contributions of the Israeli Jewish population in arms, of Israeli right-wing activists who have stood at the borders of Gaza and tried to block even the little bits of aid which the Israeli state has been prepared to allow through at times. And it's a genocide which has been supported ideologically and practically by a very large segment of Israeli society, by the political opposition, by most of the media, and by the vast majority of public opinion. So in this sense, it is, I've called it a democratic genocide. Israel isn't by any means a perfect democracy, even for Jews, but nevertheless, I think you get what I mean there. The other thing about it is that it's an international genocide. It's being carried out with the essential support of the United States, which of course now is in a direct partnership under Trump with Netanyahu to complete the genocide with the project of forcible removal of the whole population from the territory, although we don't know yet whether they will be able to achieve that or how. And this is an international genocide also in the sense that there has been the active support of most of the rest of the West. The state and civil society and media in most Western countries most of the time, including, of course, particularly in the United Kingdom. I'll come back to this in a moment. But I also want to talk about the consequences of Gaza. I gave the title for this talk of the genocide which changed the world. And I did that because studying genocides in general and more comparatively, I'm very well aware that unfortunately, many genocides, if you think of in places like Myanmar or Sudan or Ethiopia, these do not change the world. They change for the worse the lives of hundreds of thousands or millions of people, but they don't change the world, they don't change the international politics. But this genocide in Gaza is changing the world and has changed the world. And I think this is in a number of important ways. First, in the rest of Palestine, this has led to a rapid acceleration of what has been called the slow motion genocide that has been happening through terror, through expulsions, through expropriation over many decades. And what we have seen in the last year or so in the West Bank in particular is the use of the same methods that are being used in Gaza in local areas of the West Bank to destroy Palestinian society in particular localities, in particular towns and villages and refugee camps. So we think of Jabalia and what has been done to that in Gaza, but what has been done to Jenin is not that different in a sense. It is fundamentally the same process. And what this genocide has also done, therefore, is to reveal the underlying structure of genocide in Palestine, the way in which the project of a Jewish state has led over a century, and particularly since 1948, to a structure of which has included and been focused on the systematic, if often gradual, removal of the Palestinians from their homeland. And that is fundamentally the situation in Gaza, and that can be considered a structure of genocide in the sense that it is has been a project to destroy, either in whole or in part, the Palestinian society in the whole territory of Palestine. And this is something which it was taboo to talk about in general, in politics, in intellectual life, and including in the field of genocide studies until very recently. I think what Israel has done in Gaza has broken that taboo. We can now talk about the underlying genocidal dynamics in Palestine in the long term. When I first analyzed the Nakba as a case of genocide in an article 15 years ago, the Israeli historian Omar Bartov accused me of clearly meaning to delegitimize the state and say that it was born in the blood of innocence and should therefore also go down in blood. Of course, that wasn't what I meant. Today, not only does Bartov recognize the genocide in Gaza, to his credit, but it's clear that if anyone is going down in blood, it is the Palestinians, and if anyone is delegitimizing Israel, it is the Israeli state itself. So I think this is another fundamental change, but there are larger changes. Israel has been largely successful so far, and especially now with Trump's support in carrying out this genocide in Gaza. And its success has emboldened it to project military power more widely in the Middle East, to extend what I call its sub-imperial project to dominate and intimidate the surrounding states. So we have seen in Lebanon, in southern Syria, in Yemen, the way in which the Israeli state has projected military force, often in ways that are very similar to what is happening in Gaza, and then most recently in the war against Iran, which, although it's supposed to be targeted against the Iranian nuclear facilities, has in fact hit hard at civilian centers within various parts of Iran, and has terrorized whole populations. The whole population of the greater Tehran area basically terrorized out of their homes in recent weeks. So although these are not genocides in the way that Gaza is a genocide, there is a sort of genocidal logic in the way in which these wars or military adventures have been carried out. And I think that's another important consequence. And globally, the consequences are large. This, I think, this genocide has established unequivocally that the West has hardly any more interest in international law and legitimacy than, say, Russia or China. South Africa's case in the International Court of Justice and the charges which the International Criminal Court has brought against Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant are very important developments. They're symbolically very important, and we should continue to focus on them. But they have been systematically ignored by virtually all Western states. And of course, in the case of the ICC, the United States has actually taken deliberate action to destroy, to try to destroy that and undermine that court. And we heard recently that our former Prime Minister and recent Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, threatened and tried to bully the chief prosecutor of the ICC into dropping his charges. So this Western hostility to international justice, well, to which there are some exceptions, important exceptions, but nevertheless, this Western hostility to international justice has sharpened deeply with what has happened in the last 20 months. And so we're in really a period which I call the new age of genocide, where the old period of humanitarian intervention, of responsibility to protect, is over. We're in a period where the powerful will do what they want without even bothering to dress it up in international legal terms. So I think it's worth concluding by asking, where does this leave Europe, and in particular the UK? There's been a stark contradiction between European leaders' recognition of Trump's unreliability for the defense of Ukraine and Eastern Europe, with their refusal to criticize him over Iran, their very weak criticisms of him over Gaza, and their sycophancy towards him in general, offering up huge increases in defense spending, which will break social cohesion in European countries. And Western European leaders have basically clung to the idea that Israel is an ally and represents Western values. And this can only really bode very badly for European integration, European unity, and for Western values. The United Kingdom is particularly emblematic of this contradiction. We have a government led by lawyers with an apparently activist Attorney General, and they all know that the Iran war was illegal. They all know that Gaza is a cesspit of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I think they all know really that on any rigorous accounting, it is a genocide. But of course, they still regard Israel as a fundamental ally. They continue to offer it military and political support, even as they make token criticisms of its most recent atrocities. And nothing really fundamental has changed there. What has changed, I think, and that what those token criticisms represent is a growing disillusion in the wider society with what we have been fed over the last 20 months in support of Israel's activities in Gaza. So I think the environment is changing. I think the anti-Semitism has lost some of its efficacy. It's very difficult to believe that Jewish civilians in Britain or students in British universities are the main victims when we see tens of thousands of people being murdered, we see tens of thousands of children mutilated and bereaved. We see all these atrocities day after day. And people, I think, have rejected some of these ideas, and they no longer have the pull. Public opinion is changing. Apparently, almost half the population, according to a recent poll, believe that Gaza is a genocide. Few people want the kind of wars that the UK government is apparently prepared to tolerate from the Americans and the Israelis, and young people are very strongly pro-Palestinian. So these things are changing, and that we can, I think, we can use these changes in public opinion to swing some of the arguments about Palestine. And we have in the immediate future this question of the ban on Palestine action. And I think this could fail in the same way. It could be seen as overreaction, in the same way that the attempt to smear the Palestine's solidarity campaign marches was, I think, generally unsuccessful in the first few months of the genocide. So we have a shift. I don't think we should overestimate it, because one thing I notice is that there are media which now start to talk about Gaza in genocidal terms, in terms of a genocide, but they don't follow through. They don't actually say what you would expect them to say editorially. If you are recognizing a genocide, then that needs to be stopped, something needs to be done. And they're not saying that mostly. And that's really a third layer of denial, which I take from Stan Cohen's framework. He has what he calls implicatory denial. So even where people recognize, some of the center-left press in this country now recognizes that genocidal events are happening in Gaza, maybe there is a genocide. Nevertheless, they don't follow through and say that the UK needs to stop its support of Israel, drop its alliance, it needs to pivot 180 degrees to support of the Palestinians. So in conclusion, I would say there are opportunities for the Palestinian cause. To take them, I suppose we have to recognize this core contradiction between the way Israel is empowered in the short term, Israel appears to be successful, and the fact that under the surface and in the shifts in public opinion, Israel is being delegitimized, and its actions are becoming less and less supported by the people. I think in the long run, Gaza will be recognized as the fundamental genocide of our time, maybe as Rwanda was in the 1990s. But our challenge is to make a difference here and now for the civilian population who are suffering in Gaza and indeed in the rest of the Palestinian territories. And that, I suppose, I hope, is one of the things that we will discuss in the rest of this conference.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. My question is, what possible definition is Keir Starmer using for genocide? Because every time he's asked whether there is a genocide, he claims it doesn't fit in with his definition. And I just struggle to see what it is.
Well, shall I answer directly? Yes? Yeah? Shall I? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't think Keir Starmer has expressed the definition clearly, has he? I mean, no, he, like David Lammy, David Lammy tried to say that it was a question of numbers, even though he himself had recognized the genocide at Srebrenica, where there are 7,000 or 8,000 victims as a case. And he somehow seemed to suggest that what was happening in Gaza with tens of thousands of victims didn't fit. So I don't think I don't think that Starmer has offered even that sort of justification. I think what they are doing, what Starmer is doing all along, is all the time really, is to evade, is to talk in weasel words, to obfuscate. It's noticeable, really, isn't it, that this week he has apologized for 4 mistakes, but he hasn't apologized for any of his mistakes in relation to Gaza, and that's really shocking. And I think one of the other things that's shocking is that the Parliamentary Labour Party are not holding to account for that. There have been rebellions now over issues like PIP, and all credit to the MPs who are rebelling over those issues, but they have not rebelled over the policy on Gaza.
Hi, I'm from Alga TV. You mentioned the anti-national law being broken in Gaza, and especially the genocide is like a war crime. But you don't, I don't know, I covered many wars, but the veto is not more bigger and stronger than international law means. You don't think like whatever international laws say, when it comes to veto, mean nothing?
Sorry, I didn't really...
So, the veto, for example, we've got like 2 groups now, like
yes.
Russia and China one side,
yeah.
United States, America, Britain, and France in other sides. If you've been any nation, either Gaza or been victim of one of those, end of the day, going to be veto, because you see like ICC, International Criminal Court, they have like think against Netanyahu, but there's nothing being done because the power is in veto. So either the Washington, United States, they're using it. So Benjamin Netanyahu feel like safe. So what you don't think is the international law is being broken by veto? That's what my question is.
Right, I see, yes. Well, good question, thank you, yeah. Well, I've read 2 or 3 articles in the last few days about how international law is broken, if not dead, and I think it is a very, very serious challenge to international law, this present situation, because the fig leaves have been dropped, and Western countries who were so keen to enforce international law when Russia was committing terrible crimes are not prepared to enforce it against Netanyahu, or indeed to invoke it or to recognize its force against what the United States is doing itself. Because what the US has done in the last week or so against Iran is a clear breach of international law. So I think we face a very serious challenge there. I think the thing for those of us who support Palestine, and indeed for those people who support Ukraine, is to be quite clear that we uphold international law in all instances and against all powerful states which abuse their positions and carry out genocides or atrocities against civilians, and that we reject the way in which powerful states weaponize it or abuse it to serve partisan agendas. So we're not prepared to accept that it should only be invoked against Russia. We're not prepared to accept, on the other hand, that it should only be invoked against Israel. It should be, or the United States, it should be invoked against all these states and others which commit fundamental crimes against civilian populations. And that I think is that's where we have to stand. At the moment, we're lacking governments and countries which will stand with us, but there are some which have whose leaders have begun to speak out, and like Spain and Ireland, and I think that's important.
We have 3 more questions, or 4 at the front, so I'll pass the mics to them. Over here, we have one in the middle too. So we'll start from here.
Hi, I'm Sima Saida. Thank you for that really informative speech. My question is, as you said, Western powers are not going to be supporting international law for the Palestinians. I'm a bit skeptical of the idea that this is a break, because we've had Iraq and we've had Afghanistan, and there's been no accountability for that either. My question is there a way that we should be continuing to campaign for international law to actually be applied? And is that actually something that's really possible? Is there a material or a strategic vision of how global movements can actually make the West accountable under existing international law frameworks? Or do we actually need to completely rethink the international order and the institutions and what we have, and how that they can be reshaped and remade? And where can we go for guidance about something new, or thinking about something new? Because I feel a kind of vacuum of maybe ideas or vision, and I'm really searching for something that to point a way forward. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Some big questions there, and important questions. I mean, I agree that this isn't a total break with what has gone before. Where I think it is a break is that the blatant character of the rejection of international law by Western leaders, the complete dismissal of it by Trump, effectively. So I think international law is not, as it exists, is not perfect, but it has enabled important judgments, like the judgment of the ICJ about the illegality of the occupation, like the judgment that genocide is a highly plausible risk in Gaza. So these judgments have been made, and I think we have to take hold of those and do what we can with them. But I agree with you that there is a bigger challenge than that. That is not enough, and the challenge is really how to develop a global coalition of social movements and those states that are willing to sign up, governments that are willing to sign up, to try and impose some of that agenda against the will of the United States and major Western countries. I think in Europe and in Britain, part of our task is really to try and deepen the split between our countries and the US, the dominant US trajectory. Because I think there are lots of, I mean, the British state is clinging close to America at the moment, and and Starmer is cozying up to Trump as far as he possibly can. But there isn't really the support for this in the society. I don't think this, and I think for some of the implications, return of nuclear weapons, things like this, I don't think there is the support. So we have somehow to build movements, not just around Palestine, but around other issues, and to link them together. I don't have a magic recipe, though, for how this should be done. I think that's something we're going to have to discuss collectively over the coming months and years.
Thank you. Recognizing that the government, I'm staying with the UK, recognizing that the legislature is not doing its duty. The government is not doing its duty. Public opinion, there is a chasm between the public opinion, at least I think, and the politicians and the political parties. And taking into account that the undoubted independence of the English judiciary, do you think there are room for taking legal action which can produce some results?
Well, that's an interesting question, really, isn't it? Because the British government is sailing pretty close to the wind with the way it has enabled Israel's genocide, with its use of RAF planes to carry out surveillance missions over Gaza, which cannot really be justified by the return of the hostages in a situation where Israel long since abandoned the return of the hostages as an immediate goal and subordinated that to the project of raising Gaza to the ground. I mean, it doesn't add up, does it? And I wonder if someone were to find a way of taking legal action against the British government over something like that, they wouldn't actually get somewhere. But in the end, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure I can really give you the full answer to this question. But I think there must be some scope. And of course, we already had the action over the F-35 parts, which is a very important action and needs to be supported. I think legal action could be a part of how we challenge the British government. But the main thing we need to do is to arouse a political opposition, which will make Labour think twice about the way which they've gone.
Yeah, we have a question over here.
Just as in English law, there's a separation between the judiciary and the executive. I think when we're dealing with international law, we have to go beyond the political expediencies of governments. Clearly, European governments have an agenda which has nothing to do with justice or rights. So they'll never understand genocide and definitions. And I think it's very artificial for us to keep going round in circles as to whether Keir Starmer or Lamy or Trump or anybody understands what genocide means. We have to go beyond, we have to go outside this very narrow frame, go beyond these politicians and look at the law and the justice and the rights of a people who have been dispossessed, delegitimized, whereas the invader has been legitimized, and we are all very sensitive about Jewish sensitivities, but we are not sensitive about the suffering of the Palestinians for the last 80 years or so. And I think the narrative needs to change so that people need to focus that this is a nation which has been dispossessed and it has inalienable rights. Whether it comes through the international courts or the international community, the narrative has to change, and we need to go beyond October the 7th, because that has absolutely nothing to do with it, or Hamas. And Hamas, of course, whoever they may be, they are, of course, victims of this entire project which the British colonialism started. I think to see the application of international law, you have to get away from the politicians, because they're only interested in corporate finance and corporate profits, and they are part of the conspiracy. And I think until we recognize that, we will be like the insect going around in the sack of rice or something. Really, we need to broaden our minds and look way beyond this into the overarching rights of a people who have lost their nation and their country.
We had a question over here too.
Well, it's very difficult to disagree with, especially with what you said in that last sentence. That is, I think, the fundamental position that everyone here would agree with.
Thank you very much for your presentation. In it, you were talking about international actors, international genocide, and you covered the US and the West. What does the neighbors of Palestine in the Middle East, notably Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, as well as the global South, what is their role in responding to the genocide in Gaza?
Well, I think that is a good question. I suppose it is something I could have gone into. I mean, it's quite clear that the Arab states surrounding Palestine and Israel are, for the most part, implicitly supportive of Israel's intention to destroy Hamas and to neutralize Gaza, I think, as they would see it, and to neutralize the question of Palestine. And so there's a big question there, isn't there? About, obviously, Arab states cannot say this in public, and they all express various degrees of support for the Palestinians and opposition to what Israel is doing in Gaza. But in reality, they are complicit. And I was struck when there's an outfit in London called Forensic Architecture, who analysed the Saudi-backed peace plan for Gaza. I was struck by the fact that they observed that this plan incorporated the military corridors which Israel had established in Gaza. That was part of the plan that they were putting forward. So we have, both long-term and very immediate complicity, I think. And I mean, the question about the global South in general is a somewhat different one. But I think it's true that there are a lot of states which have expressed support and sympathy for the Palestinians and opposition in principle to what Israel is doing, without doing anything very practical to support the people of Gaza, and that's another form of complicity, and I think that's where we are in a way with the some of the left in Britain and other Western countries today, where there has been this shift in opinion in the last few months, and but still not really coming to hard points about how the thing can be shifted.
Thank you very much, Professor Martin. I think that was very insightful, and I think there's a lot to reflect on during the day and the rest of the panels that we're going to be having from your speech. And also, I would like to remind everyone who didn't get a chance to ask their question is that we will have 2 other panels, so you will have plenty of time to ask questions and interact more as well with our speakers. And you will also be able to interact with them in the break that we're going to be having between the first panel and the second panel. But for now, I would like to welcome our first panel, which is about the double standards and has the media failed in its coverage of the Gaza genocide. I would like to welcome our panelists, Omar Ghazzi, Faisal Hanif, and Rachel Shabi, moderated by British author and political commentator Ali Milani.
They just want us to say the order of the pictures. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, I'm the least interesting one, so if you don't hear me, that's all right. Thank you so much to ICJP for having us. This is going to be a really, really interesting panel. And what we're going to focus on in this panel is the way that the British media has covered the genocide in Gaza, the bias that exists in the British media and why that might exist. We've got a brilliant panel of experts who will be able to give differing perspectives and being able to give us an insight into why that might be the case, how it's the case, and some of the stories from both within and outside the British media. Look, I think part of the reason why this conversation is so important, the audience we have in front of us today is a highly engaged, highly sort of connected to this situation, whether it's from a personal perspective or an academic perspective or simply a moral one. But the reality is, given the life and difficulties facing most of the British public, the engagement that they'll get on this issue is largely through the prism of the media and how that story is told to them. Most folks across Britain have enough going on in their lives where they don't have an academic sort of injection into what's going on. They have bills to pay and kids to pick up from school and all the difficulties that they may face. So the story that they get about what's going on in Gaza and pretty much anywhere around the world is through the prism of what they see on their TV screens and what they hear through the radio, if anyone's still listening to radio, or other forms of media. And that's why this conversation is so important. So much like our Prime Minister, I'm going to start left and move right in terms of our wonderful panelists. Oh, that's going to get me kicked out of the party by the end of the day. So Faisal Hanif is joining us, is a media analyst at the Center for Media Monitoring and is a writer focusing on Islamophobia in the British media, which I'm really interested in as well. He's authored major reports on the British media's coverage of Israel's war in Gaza and has previously worked as a news reporter and researcher at the Times and the BBC. Dr. Omar Ghazzi is an associate professor in the Department of Media and Communications at LSE, where he also serves as the deputy head of the Department in Education. He's worked on the geopolitics of global communications, particularly in relation to news and popular culture. And then Rachel Shabi is a journalist and author who is a contributing writer to The Guardian and has written extensively on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and other current affairs. She's authored Not the Enemy, Israel's Jews from Arab Lands, and Off-White, The Truth About Anti-Semitism. Rachel has really been one of the leading voices, both in pointing out the media bias as it relates to coverage of Palestinians and Gaza, but also on this particular case. So Rachel, if I may start with you, and I'm going to ask our panelists to do me a favor. We're going to try and keep this as conversational as possible, if that's okay, because I really like to get to the audience as well. I always think dialogue is better than monologue. So Rachel, if I could start with you, can you give us a sort of overview? We are a couple of years in now about how the media has covered the war in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, and give our audience a perspective of, if a bias exists, how it manifests itself.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ali. I think the first thing to say about media at large is that it's utterly failed in the task of reporting this genocide accurately, and hence it's helped to enable it, helped to make it possible, helped to perpetuate it. So to me, it's the most brutal version that I've seen in my life of the manufacturing of consent for this most savage and dystopian hell on earth for Palestinians in Gaza for the past 20 months. So I can signpost a few of the key ways in which that failure has taken hold, but I think that our other panelists are going to have much more analytical, sort of high-res commentary on that, and certainly have been involved in reports on that. So I'll leave the detail there. But I just want to give a couple of examples. So I have been a broadcast media commentator over the last 20 months. And the first thing to say is that, you know, it's clearly easier for me. You know, yes, it's hard, and yes, there's disruptions, and you get interrupted, and you get bulldozed, and you get asked biased, hostile, leading questions, and distortions, and all the rest of it that we've seen. But, you know, I look like this, and I'm an Israeli-born Brit, and I can clearly see the difference, you know, it's clear that Palestinians, time and again, are relentlessly put on trial, certainly by the British media. I think we can see examples of it in the US as well. Palestinians who know Gaza well, who come from Gaza, who have potentially lost lives, have families and have lost lives in Gaza, are interviewed and put on trial. They're treated as spokespeople for Hamas unless they vociferously and, you know, give enough evidence to show that they're not. And, you know, these are people who are simply not treated as reliable narrators of their own story. Again and again and again, we've seen versions of that on our broadcast media. So that's the first thing to say. But just to give you an example, so I appeared on a Sky Press preview in April this year. The press preview is on Sky, where we review tomorrow's front pages. And I have to say, it's a very frustrating thing to do because the front pages of a largely right-leaning media don't actually provide much substance. So you have to kind of, you know, take it in different directions so you can get the substance in. And there's been very few headlines, very few front pages on Gaza, which, you know, as we know, we have a live stream genocide for it not to be making front page news, for these horrific stories and atrocities that we've been hearing about, for not to make front page news is itself a distortion and an abject failure. So on this particular day, it was April 2025, the Guardian front page was covering a deadly attack on Kiev, a Russian attack. I was on with Tim Montgomery, who's like a Tory, but now reform supporting right-wing commentator. I just want to read to you what he said in response to a front page story. It's the visual, the image on that front page is it's an elderly woman who's obviously been pulled out of a bombed building. She's wearing a bloodied nightdress. She's covered in dust and debris. She's shell-shocked. She's stunned, and she's being escorted by a rescue team out of the bombed area. So Tim Montgomery, I'm just going to read to you what he said. I don't know if we can get a close-up on that image on The Guardian. We did get a close-up of that image. But sometimes the photo speaks more than 1,000 words. And I look at that woman there, clearly absolutely bewildered, bloodied, probably dragged from her bed at home in Kiev. And I'm sure, like a lot of people, I see my mum in that image. And that's what this is about. It's almost as though the failure of the West and the failure of America in particular to get a grip of what, I don't know if we can even call them peace talks. They're not peace talks in any meaningful sense, but it is almost like Putin is feeling emboldened at the moment. And I look at that lady there, bewildered, shocked, and you don't know how injured she is, but that's the consequence, you know? This isn't a game. This isn't something about Trump's Nobel Peace Prize that he wants or whatever. This is real life consequence. Now, of course, I then said, well, that's exactly how I and many people feel about Gaza. And, you know, it's horrendous that, you know, you rightly humanize a civilian victim of Russia's war, but so rarely is that basic dignity afforded to Palestinians in Gaza. And it was just, I just think it's really painful because in every sentence of what he says, like the hypocrisy is screaming out at you, you know? Every single sentence, you could replace Putin with Netanyahu and it would still make sense, right? But that never happens, right? And I think the biggest crime of the media failing in this task of reporting is this omission. It's this inability to afford to humanize Palestinians at a moment when the political drumroll has dehumanized them. It's the media responsibility to redress that, and it completely failed in that capacity. And that dehumanization is what has enabled this war, this genocidal war, to carry on for so long and to be enabled and facilitated by the West for so long. By the way, let's first of all reject this framing that this is a war facilitated by the West. Israel is treated like an ally because it is an ally, right? And that's the fundamentals of the way the media has reported this war. You and I and gazillion other people might disagree with an establishment view that Israel is a useful ally. However, that is the establishment view, that Israel is a useful ally. It does the job for the establishment. You know, the German chancellor actually said the quiet part out loud over Israel's attacks on Israel's preemptive illegal attack on Iran recently, where he said Israel was doing the dirty work for the West with its attacks on Iran. I think we should just keep that front and center. The reason Palestinians call it an American-Israeli war is that actually that's what it is. The other thing that I wanted to say, and you know, the dehumanization is is key, I think. And this, you know, a lot of Palestinians talk about how this isn't just horrendous for Palestinians, which of course it is. You know, they don't just talk about the imperative of stopping a genocidal war, but they talk about the collapse of our shared humanity in itself, the collapse of a legal system that Martin talked about and others have talked about, the collapse of our capacity to have any kind of tenet of universalism, because now we're in a situation, you can see it with Ukraine, and you can see it with the way that the media talks about Israeli victims versus Palestinian victims. And I know, well, I'm guessing that Hanif might talk about the statistics. Not Hanif, sorry, Faisal might talk about the statistics on that, the disproportionate compassion for Israeli victims, as we see with Ukrainian victims of Russian invasion. The way the divisive nature of that, the way it shatters our universalism, because we are forced to pick a flag for our humanity. We've been forced to do that, and that is horrendous. And that's the sort of collapse of shared humanity itself that a lot of people are talking about. And that's what that dehumanization versus the elevation of different groups of people and different nationalities of people has done. The other thing, do I have a bit more?
Yeah, go for it.
The other thing I wanted to talk about was the failure in terms of the fact that Israel has closed off journalists, access to media in Gaza for 20 straight months now. First of all, more journalists have been killed in Gaza than in both world wars, the Vietnam War, the wars in Yugoslavia, and the US war in Afghanistan combined, according to a Brown University report that came out in April. I think, I'm not sure if someone here has mentioned it, but it has been mentioned several times that, you know, most journalists cannot even bring themselves to, you know, talk about that, the scale of that, the significance of that, and offer solidarity with Palestinian journalists in Gaza. Now, Israel is saying, sorry, you can't come in because it's too dangerous, but at the same time is putting out this line, and pro-Israel organizations are putting out this line that, well, you also can't trust reporters out of Gaza because they're all, you know, either Hamas affiliated or they're being suppressed, censored by Hamas. And it's like, we don't see the, you know, international media say, sorry, Israel, you can't have it both ways. You can't say you're banned as international journalists, but you can't trust any stringers on the ground. Like, it's such a trap. And the fact that international media has not called this out day after day, has not even said, okay, Israeli spokespeople, we are not going to run your commentary unless you either A, give us access to Gaza, or B, stop harassing and delegitimizing and murdering Palestinian journalists in Gaza. So that is another, just a fundamental failure that has shaped the way that the conversation has played out for 20 months. And that in itself is also, you know, unforgivable, number two. I just wanted to talk about one last thing of just the basics, the way that the obfuscation has happened has just been such a dereliction of the most basic things about journalism. We all know that with journalism, you know, the basic news reporting, who, what, when, where, how, right? And lately, how much, right? Now, I often think about the way that the media has been reporting Gaza. I often think about, well, you know, that's an area that's a region that I happen to know reasonably well. You know, I've reported from Israel-Palestine for years. I've followed it for years. I kind of think, how would I understand this if I knew nothing about this region, which, you know, I can say about many regions in the world that I know very little about. How would I understand it if it was X country, X conflict that I don't know about? And the answer is I wouldn't. I would have no idea what was going on because those basics have been completely absent. The who's doing it, why is it happening, who's been affected, what exactly happened, and what's the context, all of those things have been completely stripped. So I'm guessing that quite a few of you might be following the historian of the modern Middle East, Asal Rad. She's been got this become known as the headline fixer because what she's been doing for the last 20 months and actually long before has been like fixing the headlines that we see in our print media because they are failing to do this most basic task of journalism, who, what, when, where, How? So she runs through a few, I can give you a few examples of some headlines that she's fixed. So New York Times, December 29, 2023. Deadly airstrike hits area of Gaza that many have fled to. Now, again, assuming I don't know this region, what the hell does that mean? Right? Who did the airstrike? I don't know. It's not in the headline. Could be anyone, right? She corrects it to deadly Israeli airstrike hits area of Gaza that Israel told Palestinians to move to, which is what happened. Israel forced the displacement of most of the population of Gaza, corralled them into an area it proclaimed was safe, and then proceeded to bomb them and kill them anyway. One of the most egregious of these that she points to is New York Times again. She covers other papers, but New York Times is a big offender. This is November 2024, sorry, this is February 24, with the Flower Massacre that probably a lot of you already know about, where Israel opened fire on thousands of starving Palestinians in Gaza who were trying to get some aid, which of course has been blockaded by Israel. There's piles of aid on the borders, each border of Gaza, but none of it can get through. And so this headline in the New York Times, February 2024, in chaotic Gaza scene, many are killed and wounded as Israelis open fire. And Asal zones in on this in chaotic Gaza scene. Again, what is that? Like, if it's a very sort of Western gaze on Middle East, Africa, chaos, right? Just chaotic people, lawlessness, failed states, chaos. Doesn't actually tell us why it's chaotic. Many are killed and wounded as Israel opens fire. And it's like, well, yeah, there's starving Palestinians who've been desperately queuing for aid, and Israel opened fire on them. That's what happened. That's what the story was. And Asal, again, she draws, like many of us have done, the comparison with Ukraine, where Putin is starving as a weapon of war parts of Ukraine and Ukrainians in part of Ukraine, and it is stated as such. It is stated as a weapon of war. And again, that obfuscation. And the last thing I want to say, just because Martin was talking about it in such depth and in such important detail, the way that the ICJ's conclusion that there was a plausible risk of genocide and Israel should take immediate steps to prevent that, and which was completely ignored by Israel and of course obfuscated by global leaders and media. Again, such a basic failure. In any other context I can imagine, what would you do with an accusation of genocide to your audience, right? You'd say, okay, well, let's have the conversation about what it means. If you're not prepared to allow people to say out loud, it's a genocidal war, which of course we've seen has not been allowed, then at least have the conversation. What does it mean? What are the criteria that need to be met before it is deemed to be a genocide? Has Israel met these criteria or not? Do genocide scholars think there has been a genocide? And if so, why? And if not, why not? And can we have that debate? Just on that basic level of, you don't have to agree with it, but at least explain to people what's happening. None of that happened. And we've seen versions of that again and again and again for the last 20 months. As I say, this has enabled and manufactured consent for this genocidal war. And, I want to say that, there are a lot of people in media who are pushing back, but basically the direction of travel from the higher ups has been to obfuscate, to deny, to delegitimize certain voices, to dehumanize certain voices, and essentially to enable this to take place for so long.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was brilliant. Dr. Ghazzi, I'm going to come to you next because I kind of want to ask you about this, your sort of perspective on the media bias that Rachel has quite eloquently put forward, but also there does seem to be, in my view, tell me if I'm wrong, but a serious disconnect between the population now, the citizens, and the media. So I'm looking at a survey that just came out on public opinion on brand trust with the media. And bar BBC and Channel 4, which have about half a 50% to 60% trust rate, all other media in the UK, at least half of the British public don't trust them to tell the news fairly, in essence. And that certainly seems true of Gaza, because we can see public opinion has shifted significantly in favor of seeing what's happening in Gaza as a genocide and the crimes that are being committed. So can you talk a little bit about your perspective on the media bias, and if that is actually harming these media institutions? Because unlike previous times, people on their social media can see what's happening in live time, and it's causing serious brand issues for these media organizations.
Yes, thank you. Well, let me perhaps first maybe zoom out a bit and think about what we are all identifying as bias and as failure. And here, like perhaps when we use the term failure, we have to consider what are these media outlets actually wanting to achieve, and whether, so do we judge the failure based on what they want to achieve, or what our assumptions are about the values of journalism? Because that is what we're judging them against. And I think like when we talk about bias or omissions, it seems as if this is happening by itself rather than part of a concerted, concentrated effort, which in my formulation, I'm working on kind of a piece to kind of think about what's happening, and I call it a war on history in terms of the narratives that we are getting. And history here, part of it is in relation of the extreme decontextualization, we can say, about of Palestine and the Palestinian struggle. Part of that is from the Nakba onwards, the history of the struggle for self-determination for Palestinians, but also in relation to Gaza itself. We don't hear that this is actually the fifth major war on Gaza, this fifth major military operation since 2008. We don't hear about the March of Return, the peaceful demonstrations that happened there and how they were met with extreme violence as well. We don't know that the people of Gaza, the majority of them are in fact refugees from areas that are now in Israel. The war on history is also in relation to the present, to manufacture consent, as was said, to be complicit, also enable this genocidal war to continue and to happen, and to provide cover for it. So perhaps even the way that we use the word coverage, I think we need to rethink how that is applied. And also the history of the future, in the sense that we know that journalism is often said to be the first draft of history. And this is not just about a war for what is happening today, but also for the historic record for the future. And it is very difficult to account for silence. For instance, I'm an academic, I'm a university teacher. Students write dissertations and essays every year. What do? They do research. Research of what? Of existing articles, of existing reports. And when when the overwhelming reports from legacy media are painting this particular picture, it becomes the legacy of that is also for the future, for what would be the archives of the future as well. So we have to think across kind of these timeframes. And to elaborate on the idea of silence and silencing. So how do we account for what is unsaid? How can we think about narratives that were not told, and how that silence is actually achieved? And I think here also your report plays an important part, because it explains that through evidence. But we can talk about, for example, the way that the policing around how the story starts, how the news story starts. And of course, we know that when this war started, there was a concerted effort to begin the story with October 7. Nothing happened before. And there was a policing around it in the sense of people always being asked to condemn Hamas because that is the only starting point for the conversation. And so when we take it not only in terms of what an individual said, when we think about it in relation to a discourse, as I'm trying to do in relation to, okay, if we take all these media material starting in the same way, what is happening? And what is happening is the policing of how the story starts. Another way is to think about what is it called. So the term genocide. Now, genocide is a word, it's just a word that has a, but when we think about also the kind of extreme efforts to police who gets to use the word genocide and why not to use it, it is about complicity, and it is about not kind of using words that are accurate in this context, but it is also about the West itself, because when we think even of the West and how we perceive the West, what kind of the political meaning of the West that has in the world, the liberal framework, of the idea that the West is the imagined geography of morality. When they don't use the term, they want basically, I think the Western establishment wants to be the one to be able to designate what is a genocide and what is not. It is not South Africa that can do that. It is not us in this room. Illusions, them, evidence in that moral arbitrator, this illusion, despite all the evidence in the past that they are the moral arbitrators of this world, and that if they don't designate a particular kinds of violence as genocide, then it is not genocide because they are the ones that have that power. And this is about also maintaining the kind of the liberal discursive glue that holds the West together. And so perhaps that speaks to the idea of why this is further eroding what holds the West together, how we witness conflicts. Because even if we think of witnessing, for example, another word that comes from that lexicon. So witnessing is not just viewing; it is viewing atrocity with a moral lens, with acknowledging crimes against humanity. And again, who is it that gets to witness? If it is not sanctioned by Western politicians, it is as if it is not happening. And I think a lot of us feel perhaps like it takes a toll on our mental health, because they make us feel as if we're crazy, that we are witnessing, and we got the media, we got the political establishment telling us, oh no, that's not happening. And here we can go back to reading Fanon and kind of thinking about colonial structures and how they affect the mind. And one way to also study silence is to think about the differences in speech in different contexts. So as you said, in relation to Ukraine, for example, and here it's so obvious, it really doesn't need to be said. One example is the president of the European Union describing the cutting of electricity as an act of terror, and making it very clear that the naming of it as act of terror is very important. She said, let me be clear, this is an act of terror, this is what it's doing. So such clarity when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, but of course silence when it comes to Palestine. And here, we also have to say that it is sad that they put us in this position as if we want to belittle what's happening in Ukraine, or what happened the genocide in Rwanda, or in the Balkans. But we are forced to do this because that's one route where we can say, hey, look, there's a manufacturing of silence here, because that is we can see the difference, even though we should build on kind of the on solidarity with different people in the world as violence spreads. And if I may, just like 3 final points in terms of how this war on history happens. The pressure on people, on media workers. Here, when we say the media, you know, we tend to think like we use media as a shorthand and as if everybody who works in mainstream media is complicit. But we have to also remember people are under a lot of pressure. It's very difficult to work in mainstream news with kind of the financial pressure and the time pressure and your editor. And if you say something kind of that veers away from the editorial line, you'll get a lot of attention. So there is just perhaps a lack of courage, perhaps like the easy way out where you say, okay, like I'm just, you know, I'm not going to bother with saying that word. I'm not going to push because I just want to go home and, you know, I want my day to finish. So the pressure on people is part of what's going on. And here I'm talking about journalists, of course, in the West. When it comes to Palestine, we know that the killing of journalists, the mass killing, the elimination of Palestinian journalists is part of the war on history. It's part of literally targeting the bodies and killing those who have took it upon themselves to tell the world what is happening. And I don't know, like even like there's no tribute to make to these brave Palestinian journalists who put their lives on the line day in and day out to report on what is going there. And even saying the killing doesn't do justice to the, I don't know, the evil of the way that they were killed, some of them bleeding to death for hours, for example, the lack of medical care. And we see also the silence in terms of how, while journalism is celebrated as a pillar of democracy, and there's such rhetoric in relation to celebrating journalism, again, we see the double standards here. Perhaps one thing to say is that when we focus on the BBC and legacy media, we also have to remember that there's a generational divide that perhaps, you know, those of us who are middle-aged and older care more about broadcast legacy media, while young people tend to get their news from social media platforms, but also not to romanticize social media platforms because there is censorship there. The algorithm functions in a way that if you are not seeking news about what's happening in Palestine, you either will miss it or you will get biased sources as well. So there is bias in terms of how, let's say, my social media would look like versus someone else. And that is not a good model for...
yeah, you don't want to see my algorithm. It's crazy.
So, and to conclude, just to answer your question about is it harming media, certainly, I think, and that is also part of why Gaza is perhaps like it, even though there were, you mentioned, someone mentioned Iraq and Afghanistan, it's not the first time that we see such concerted effort to consent for war, but I think this goes further because I personally, I only watch BBC, like I make myself watch it because it's part of my job, but I think a lot of people have simply tuned away. They don't watch them anymore. And at a time when media are already under such pressure, financial, political economy, and political pressure, and at a time when Europe is, in fact, as we always hear from politicians, that there are a lot of security threats that it is facing, they took away the power of like one of the pillars of their public diplomacy, of their soft power in the world, of what gave them legitimacy, which is the media. And if you compare in the Middle East, for example, my parents' generation used to speak of the BBC as the truth, basically, especially given the authoritarian media in the Middle East at the time. Now nobody takes it seriously. So
yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think you've raised 2 points that I'm really glad you have that are really important. One is there's no doubt, and I think Rachel has spoken to the level of bias by design, is that fair to say, that exists particularly in legacy media? But there's also a significant amount of just incompetence and really bad, lazy journalism that exists as well. I had to do a BBC interview where I had to explain to the host that Hamas and Hezbollah are different organizations. They didn't know they were doing this on BBC. This person gets paid to speak in front of a camera. But I also think it's really important. You know, we're talking about really bad journalism, media bias, all that kind of stuff. But I think it's really important that you have highlighted as well that there are people who are risking their lives in Gaza to tell the truth. And so there are journalists both here and abroad in conflict zones and non-conflict zones who risk a lot to tell the story as well. And so while, you know, we're very highly critical, I think the profession itself is still very noble and often requires a lot of courage and bravery. Faisal, if I can come to you, because you guys have at the Center for Media Monitoring, you've done a number of reports, particularly on media bias. And the reason that that's really helpful is folks like us who experience it know what it's like, but it's often anecdotal stories. So Rachel could probably tell you 101 different stories of different forms of bias, a few of which you've shared with us today, as will Dr. Ghazzi. But you've been able to actually put it on paper and give us some data as to what that looks like in reality. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Ali. Just on Dr. Al-Ghazi's point about the BBC being the truth, that may have been the view at one point, but I'm going to disappoint him with the stuff that we found in our latest report, which has been described as incredibly damning by people like Peter Auburn, senior conservative journalist in the British media for the last 30 years. I think it's important to start before October the 7th. One of the things the media has tried to do is to anchor everything on October the 7th, October the 7th being ground zero. This is where it all starts. This was the evil of Hamas. This is what caused all of this. And, you know, Rachel highlighted some examples and some headlines from different media organizations throughout this, you know, from post-October the 7th. There's one headline that really caught my eye on October the 4th, 2023 from The Guardian. The headline went something like, the Palestinian people in Gaza were protesting on the border wall, and the headline read, Palestinians receive bullet wounds on ankles. No mention of the Israelis, no mention of who's shooting them. And I mean, I've received presents, I've received, you know, all sorts of things. I've never received bullet wounds, and it's not the type of language I would use to describe if I ever had received them, or if I ever had been shot. So I think it's important to remember that this, I mean, the whole thing didn't start on October the 7th. There's obviously a huge background to this and context. But even within the media, this kind of behavior that we've seen and the kind of reporting we've seen since October the 7th is not unique to this period. This was going on for a long, long time. What we've done at the Center for Media Monitoring, and our main purpose and our sort of USP as it was, is to look at the representation of Muslims and Islam in the British media. And quite quickly, we've noticed that there's a huge overlap with the Israel-Palestine issue and what's happened, particularly in Gaza. When October the 7th did happen, there was a huge influx of people writing into us, asking if we're monitoring the media on this. And so we've produced two reports, the latest one being an in-depth look at the BBC's coverage and how the BBC has performed. And I think one of the justifications for that being, I mean, the two major points, one being that if you noticed very early on in the current, I don't like to call it conflict, but I'll use that word for this purpose. When Rishi Sunak, when he was Prime Minister, and he was sat with the Israeli President, Isaac Herzog, Herzog before the world's media and in front of the world's screens, was lobbying the British Prime Minister about bringing the BBC into line. He complaining about the BBC, that the BBC is anti-Israel. And following that, you've had these plethora of organizations, pro-Israel organizations, media monitoring organizations, backed by the right-wing media in Britain, the Telegraph, the Daily Mail, the Times, all of these, making accusation after accusation against the BBC and accusing the BBC of being very pro-Palestinian and very anti-Israeli. And yet, as Rachel mentioned, when you look at a lot of the examples on social media, when you look at a lot of the screenshots of headlines, etc., it's quite clear that they're not. Israel is, from the very framing of this whole thing, Israel is either omitted or it's given an excuse as to why it's committing the atrocities that it has been doing. And so we thought it was very important to sort of put the skin on all of those bones, because that's what Center for Media Monitoring, CFMM as we're known, has been very good at in the past. And so we produced this study. We looked at 35,000 BBC items, both online and across broadcast radio and television. And we used AI as well as human verification to analyze all of this. And even accounting for margins of error, which you have in reports, the results were quite, the results told us what we all suspected. So if I can take you through some of those statistics just to highlight exactly what we're trying to say. So the BBC ran an almost equal number of articles, of humanizing articles, where they profiled a victim between Israeli victims and Palestinian victims, despite the fact that there were 34 times more Palestinian deaths in Gaza. So despite this huge disparity, you had these individual profiles of people, particularly hostages, hostage families. And it was noticeable that whenever there was a sort of atrocity or a new atrocity committed against people in Gaza, you had a sort of humanizing story about an Israeli hostage or what was going on in Tel Aviv or something like that. We analyzed language, and we looked at the use of what we call emotive terms. One of the reasons for that being that BBC journalists internally within the organization had complained when they wrote their letters to the people at the top, the editors, they complained about the language that was being used. So words like slaughtered and massacre and atrocities were being exclusively applied, what they felt, to describe Israeli victims as opposed to Palestinian ones. And just to give you one example, and we looked at, so we separated the use of these words on screen by guests, and particularly pro-Israel guests, who described the events of October the 7th as a massacre against the Israeli people, as people were slaughtered, etc. So we split the use of those words when they were being used by guests on the programs and when they were being used by the presenters themselves. And we found, for example, that the word massacre was used 18 times more to describe the deaths and victims of attacks by Hamas, as opposed to the Palestinian victims. So when those journalists wrote the letter, we found that their complaint about the use of emotive language was true. It couldn't be denied. The disparity was huge. Some words, for example, the word butchered was used exclusively to describe Israeli victims. So even in the language, we found that there was this huge disparity where the real emotive terms and the terms that you can say ascribe intent, things like murder, for example. So Israelis are murdered, whereas that word was hardly ever used to describe what's gone on in Gaza, despite the tens of thousands, which some say is a conservative estimate, of Palestinian deaths. So we looked at, across TV and radio, 70% of all of these emotive terms were used by BBC journalists to describe Israeli victims. I mean, one of our leading stats is that 33 times, the BBC gave Israeli deaths 33 times more coverage across articles, online articles, when measured on a per fatality basis. So despite this huge disparity in deaths between Palestinians and Israelis, the BBC effectively giving 33 times as much coverage to Israeli victims, which tells a story in itself. In terms of interviewing, I mean, the BBC interviews significantly fewer Palestinians than Israelis. So there was 2,350 Israeli representatives interviewed and only 1,085 Palestinians across TV and radio. And in terms of the role of the journalists themselves, we found that the presenters shared Israeli perspectives 11 times more frequently than Palestinian ones. So when Palestinian guests were coming on and they were making a point, part of the armory of the presenters was to hit back with, well, Israel would say this, well, Israel denies this, well, the Israelis are doing this. And that feeds into the whole aspect of genocide. We looked at, for example, how whenever this term of genocide was mentioned by the Palestinians, and we found over 100 occasions where pro-Palestinian guests or others would come on and allege or describe what was going on in Gaza or what is still going on in Gaza as a genocide. And BBC presenters themselves were shutting this down. It was almost as if there's this institutional message going around that there can be no discussion about genocide. And there was one example from Newsnight where Kirsty Walker, I think, who's an ex-presenter now, she's left, when Francesca Albanese mentioned the term genocide, Kirsty Walker's response was, can we just be clear that that's not what's happening here? Genocide is not what's happening here. So she's made that observation herself, she's made that conclusion herself, and they've put that view. So basically, the BBC is a sort of genocide-free zone. You can't mention the words genocide. October the 7th, I mentioned at the very start, the whole thing is anchored on October the 7th. So, the attacks of October the 7th are referenced in at least 40% of BBC online articles. And you'll notice this, if you read a BBC news report on Gaza, which is becoming less frequent, by the way, when we did our launch event, the BBC, to his credit, Richard Burgess, who happens to be the news director, was there, and he faced quite a grilling. And one of his, he made the point that there's significantly less coverage now on the BBC on Gaza because it seems to be, by audience measurements, less people seem to be interested in this story, my response to that would be, well, given your coverage, most people are probably switched off, and that being the reason as to why there's less eyeballs and ears on your coverage. But like I said, 40% of all articles, so you'll see an article that's talking about an event that's happening in Gaza, the killing of Palestinians, and towards the end of the article or in the middle of the article somewhere, there will always be a reference back to October the 7th. This all started on October the 7th when Hamas gunmen entered Israel and killed 1,200 Israelis. So it's all anchored there. But when it comes to, for example, occupation and the wider context of why this all took place, we found that only 0.5% of articles had any mention of Israel's occupation and the violence against Palestinians pre-October the 7th. There was zero mentions on the BBC of Netanyahu's genocidal remarks, where the biblical references to Amalek and other references. So the BBC basically ignored that. As I mentioned, 100 plus occasions where BBC presenters actively shut down genocide claims. Significantly larger number of Palestinians being detained over a larger period of time, described as prisoners, etc. And yet, Israeli hostages are mentioned 5.3 times more than Palestinian detainees across BBC coverage. So always referring back to the hostages. So the overall framing being one that would would be acceptable to sort of the powers that be in Israel. You know, Israel wants this framed as this is all about the hostages. It's got nothing to, you know, we are doing all this for our people, so we can go in and raise Gaza to the ground and do, you know, do whatever we want on the justification of hostages. And the media complicity behind that is to effectively anchor everything around those Israeli talking points. During the January 2025 hostage exchanges, 70% of articles focused on Israeli hostages, despite significantly more Palestinian prisoners and those who have been held for many, many years, sometimes decades, being released. So again, everything's anchored around the hostages. Coming to what Dr. Ghazzi mentioned and Rachel mentioned as well about journalists being killed, we found that only 6% of the journalists that were killed there was any kind of report about their killing on the BBC. So that there doesn't even seem to be this sort of unifying or coverage about people who are within the industry, you know, colleagues of you know, journalists normally see other journalists as their colleagues, and but there doesn't seem to be this sympathy, you know, when the Israelis are killing journalists and well documented. There seems to be a huge absence of this coverage. And, you know, I focused on the BBC because this is our latest report, and there has been quite a good, for our purposes anyway, there's been a great response to this and quite good coverage across the media. But we can sort of extrapolate this across the British media and the wider Western media, and there's plentiful examples of the coverage, you know, sort of post October the 7th, where many other of the news channels and many newspapers have, you know, framed this whole thing. And to go back to the early days of October 7th, many of them reported on the beheaded baby story, which was subsequently proved to be false. And one thing that I have to say is, when the press regulator IPSO was made aware of this, they took no action. They took no action, despite 7 front pages of British newspapers mentioning that story. There was no action against them to say, you have to clarify that this wasn't a true story. And we see repetition of that, especially on the right-wing news channels. It all goes back to, Hamas, the Palestinians, they murdered babies, they beheaded babies. You still continue to hear that across. And just lastly, I mean, there have been occasions of very, very good reporting. And I want to highlight one example, just to go back to the beheaded babies thing. The Times produced an investigation piece, a very, very good investigation piece, where they proved that a lot of the information that came, that was sort of given to the media behind that story and to frame that story, came from people who were incredibly unreliable, couldn't be trusted. And it was a very good investigative piece. And the backlash that the journalists got on Twitter, but from pro-Israel media monitoring groups, was incredible. And the Times response to that was, oh, we're looking into this, we're investigating it. So there's this, so even when journalists are doing an incredible job, I mean, one person I'd mention is Alex Crawford, who's constantly called out the fact that journalists are not allowed access to Gaza. Why are journalists not allowed access to Gaza? They need to be given access to Gaza so that they can report the realities on the ground. There has been this shutting down of journalists, both within the newsrooms and from the pressure that comes externally. So there has been good reporting, but overall, I mean, from what we found, I think is indisputable. The evidence is there to back up the anecdotal stuff that everybody's seen. So please do read the report and share it widely.
Yeah, I mean, I think even Piers Morgan has now spoken about the lack of access of journalists into Gaza. And you know, when Piers Morgan says that, you really lost control of the situation, because if he told me night followed day, I'd have to stick my head out the window to double check. One last question I want to ask, and I'm going to ask panelists if you could keep it to about 30 seconds to a minute, even though it's a big, big question. I'm sure we're going to come back to it when I go to questions. I just want to ask you about the role of racism and Islamophobia, particularly anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia, and what role that has played in the kind of coverage that we've been seeing. Specifically, Rachel, I'll come to you first, because you spoke about how you know, you get a slightly easier time as someone who was born in Israel in the media. One of the things I've been surprised at, and Faisal has covered it, is the lack of sort of solidarity that British journalists have shown to journalists that have died in Gaza. Because usually when that sort of stuff happens, when journalists are arrested in conflict zones or disappeared or murdered, there does tend to be some solidarity within the media establishment. That doesn't seem to be the case here. Is it because they're Palestinians in Gaza? Is there an element of racism, and what role does that play more broadly, do you think?
Yeah, the short answer is yes.
Yeah.
It is because they're Palestinians in Gaza. And obviously Faisal will have a lot more to say about this because of the reports, not just about Gaza, but about Islamophobia more generally, more widely. But yeah, you couldn't do this unless the environment was already saturated with Islamophobia. It's just one of the operating mechanisms and premises of this whole thing. And I think the thing about Islamophobia is that, you know, we can talk about all racisms as being, you know, showing up in different ways at different times and all the rest of it. The thing about Islamophobia is that it's not just that our political media conversation is not taking it seriously. It's that in many cases it's actively generating Islamophobic language and discourse, and that in itself has an impact. And, you know, somebody was mentioning the war on Iraq and the war on Afghanistan, and, you know, these things represent critical breaks in conventions, in fabrics, in understandings of the world. You know, the illegal war on Iraq and Afghanistan not only paved the way for more, you know, war crimes that weren't held to account, violations of international law. They created an architecture of permissibility, but the war on terror years that followed create this architecture of permissibility for Islamophobia as well. And I do think it undergirds so much, that racism undergirds so much of the way that this is being reported.
Yeah, I think I've particularly, I don't know if others have noticed it, I've seen a lot of cartoons recently of this sort of Israelis holding back these really barbaric Arabs that are coming to the West. And the narrative seems to be that Israel, again, like the German chancellor says, is doing the West's work for them, which kind of reinforces that. Dr. Ghazzi, do you want to speak to the
Yeah, sure. Like I also, to echo what was said, I think also we need to historicize how we got here, particularly when it comes to the label of terrorist, because like we were in a kind of a context where there is you identify someone as a terrorist and then you kill them. Now it's the other way around. Like if you kill someone, therefore that person was a terrorist. And that is like the chilling effect of what how the consent is manufactured again, of like bombing a hospital. Oh, well, there were terrorists in there, of targeting, even if you think of the documentary that the BBC was meant to show with the child, from the perspective of children, and it was not shown because one of the children is the son of a Hamas official and therefore is tainted by terrorism and not acceptable to be shown. And there's a political history for that is inseparable from the experience of Iraq, of Afghanistan, and also, and here from an Arab perspective, the complicity of Arab regimes as well, who initially, after 9/11, were against that label and tried to fight against it in international organizations, but they themselves began to use it against their own people with the Arab Spring, labeling activists as terrorists, using terrorism law to target Arab intellectuals and activists. And so there is also an Arab political cover for dehumanizing Arab and Muslims as terrorists, and that feeds into how we got here in the media coverage.
That's very interesting. Faisal, I'm going to come to you when I take the first question, if that's okay, because I've lost control of time and how time works. Do I get to pick? Do I have that? Yeah, I get to pick. Very exciting. I'm going to come to the lady, I think, in the middle in the white shirt. I'm going to pick the ones that are the hardest to the microphone to get to, just to see how good the operation is here.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts and your knowledge. Kind of to that last question you posed, Ali. on the nature of racism and Islamophobia. I'm intrigued at the moment the way that the narrative is shaped around women and children, and to that extent, how men are now quite readily excluded as being victims. I mean, I think people now who may previously not have been sympathetic to the cause are now a lot more sympathetic to women and children, and yet still finding it hard to see Arab men, Palestinian men as being victims, especially because the media poses this lens of Palestinian men in Gaza in particular, as inherently being members of Hamas. So I wondered if you could share your thoughts on that, and possibly even the way that children are, the sympathy for children is also very limited. If you could share your knowledge on that, maybe even some data, and also how the media perception of that, even the documentary, the BBC documentary that you mentioned, how it was taken down, I believe, how even that in and of itself, the BBC removing that, impacts a readership or the media consumer themselves.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to take them three at a time if that's okay, because I'm drunk with power and I'm just. Who should I take next? We'll take the lady right at the back because that will be really difficult for you to get to.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question about the representation of Palestinian Christians, and then maybe the difference between how Palestinian Muslims are represented and maybe the Palestinian Christians being seen as almost more innocent or more like civilians. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. And then one last one, hands up. Yeah, I'll come to the green shirt right here at the front.
Hello? Okay,
Yeah.
it works. I just want to say that right now, the media and just the narratives are slowly shifting in terms of gradually, even Piers Morgan is saying Israel is showing a genocidal intent. So I think to an extent, what we are talking about is kind of a bit too late in terms of the shifting of narratives. And my question is, this genocide should stop. It will stop, I hope. I think it's for the future, for upcoming. How do we humanize, or how do we get on top proactively instead of reactive to these narratives? Because after October 7th, we saw a huge barrage of Israeli PR and how monumental it was in cementing the narratives. So like, how do we preempt that? How do we be more proactive? Because it's good having these discussions now and having a dissection of what's happening now, but Israel is going to do something else. America, the West is going to try something in the Middle East or in the global South. How do we get on top and let's have a strategy moving forward?
Yeah, okay, so thank you. Faisal, if I can come to you first. I mean, you can really tackle any of the three questions, or you can do it more broadly if you'd like, but the questions were mostly, the first one was on men being readily excluded, particularly, I guess there's a lens of all men could be Hamas, and so any sympathy to victims that are men in Gaza particularly, but also children. Then a question on Palestinian Christians and whether they're seen as more innocent, and I guess the Islamophobia that might exist in that view. And then the humanization of the civilians as well.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a report on the first month's coverage from October the 7th until sort of November 6th, 2023, looked across sort of the broad spectrum of the British media. And one of the sections was on Islamophobia, and it was very, very noticeable how within hours actually of news coming out about what Hamas had done and the taking of hostages and 1,200 people being killed, you had news editors from the Jewish newspapers in Britain, the Jewish News and the Jewish Chronicle, who were on social media using Islamophobic language, calling this as part of the historic Islamic bloodlust that drives the Palestinians to do what, and drives Hamas and the Palestinians to do what they've just done. So very early on, we saw how the whole framing of this was around Islamophobia, and to turn the sort of Palestinian struggle and what they've gone through over the last 80 years into a war of sort of light and darkness. And we've seen that continue throughout, where the Israelis have pumped this message out to say to the West, we're doing your job for you, we're holding the hordes back. And this is, if we don't do this, this is coming to you. And we see pro-Israel representatives in the media since then, who then try to domesticate this issue, saying the reason the Labour Party isn't so harsh on the Palestinians and isn't as pro-Israel as we want it to be is because they're trying to appease their Muslim voters and their Muslim vote bank, and that's what drives this whole thing.
What Muslim voters? There's none left.
Exactly. And so we see that narrative seep in sort of in everywhere. And when it comes to, I mean, the lady asked the question about the lack of sympathy for the men. In terms of media coverage, I mean, we saw it when there was this when we had the release of the hostages and the swap with what they call the Palestinian prisoners, and the use of the language. Going back to the BBC termed it as there's been this swap between the hostages and Palestinians, and they counted this many women, and very specifically they said this many teenage boys. And normally you think, well, in journalistic parlance and speak, that would be children. You wouldn't use the term teenage boys, but the Israelis, I think the Israeli press releases had called them teenage boys. And we've seen this language around the idea of male age, fighting age males. So anybody above, I don't know, 10 years old, I think it may be 12 or 13, whatever it may be, but that's a very deliberate use of that language. And within the Israeli media, when they've interviewed soldiers, and certain politicians, they've openly said that if we don't kill these guys now, when they grow up, they are going to, they're going to turn into the next generation of terrorists. And we've seen the images of, people, all these men and young boys being stripped naked and, held at gunpoint. So I think that the point's well made. There is this lack of sympathy, and certain media coverage has sort of driven this. In reference to the Palestinian Christians, I think it goes back to the Islamophobia, as Ali mentioned. There's almost this, one of the jobs of the media, I believe, is to educate its audience as well, to inform them of the situation. If you're not aware of that area, and especially with a lot of the media coverage that's happened over the last sort of 20, 30 years, you would assume that Palestine is exclusively Muslim. It's an exclusively Muslim issue. And the Christian communities are sort of forgotten, and they're sort of made invisible. And because of this whole sort of Islamophobic rhetoric, I think there's a deliberate way of, or there's a deliberate policy of trying to make them invisible in all of this. And so we've seen in the last couple of days where you've seen, I think one of the villages in the West Bank, which is a Christian village, a very predominant or almost exclusively Christian village, is being burnt, has been burnt by settlers. And there's very, very little coverage about this. There's very little coverage overall about the Christian presence in Palestine, and even prominent Christians, like for example Shireen Abu Akleh, the murdered journalist. There's not much mention of the fact that she comes from a Christian background. She is Christian. She comes from a Christian family. That's all lost. So I think
there was also very little coverage. Sorry to interrupt, but the last Pope spoke quite frequently. I mean, I think one of the last phone calls he made before he died was to one of the churches in Gaza. There seems to be very little coverage of that at all.
And just to address the question the gentleman made, in terms of Piers Morgan and all these guys, I'm a skeptic, so I'm going to say that I think there's a lot of people covering their backs now. I think because the evidence is so blatant, I think there's a lot of people who are now thinking, oh God, we better go the other way, and so that's my view on it.
Yeah. Rachel, can I come to you next? Because the question about humanization, it certainly seems to me to be the case that as the truth kind of gets out, whether that's through social media or other things, and as people start to backtrack, some of the far right commentators, which you often have to sit up opposite in TV studios, are reverting into just straight up bigotry to try and dehumanize the population. Do you think that it's worthwhile there being a concerted effort to humanize the population through the media, these sort of human stories that we talk about and other things? Because if we look at the data, it has taken hold in the British public. If you look at the level of Islamophobia that exists within the British population, it's risen. So not just Islamophobia, but also anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racism as well. Is that something that needs to be done, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it goes back to what we were saying at the very start, which is, this is only possible if preemptively you've dehumanized the population, so you don't see their lives as equivalent. You don't have a universalism that says, no child, no civilian, no hospital, nowhere. Categorically, absolutely not. That you place conditions on that of who is worthy of humanity. But I just want to say, a couple of things. One about the far right, and it relates to the question about Palestinian Christians. And I agree with Faisal that, I mean, that they're not seen at all. And part of the reason for that is, one of the things that's happened, it's been accelerated since the war on terror, but has been in play for decades, is this idea that Israel, which, is in the Middle East and has a majority Middle Eastern population when you include both its Palestinian citizens and its Jews from Arab and Muslim countries, is constructed as the front line of Europe. And its leaders talk about it in those terms, and Western leaders talk about it in those terms as well. So it's like the front line in a clash of civilizations between the West and the barbaric Middle East. And by the way, the Judeo-Christian values plays a pivotal role in this, even though Judeo-Christian is not a thing, it's an invented political category. Judeo-Islamic is more accurate. So that construct in itself, which Israeli leaders rely on quite heavily and talk about a lot, has actually turbocharged the far right, who have been much more visible as commentators, as very emphatically pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian, Islamophobic commentators on this assault on Gaza, because it turbocharges and signal boosts all their fantasies, their clash of civilization fantasies, which is their way of mainlining their current obsessions, which is Islamophobia and migrant bashing. So I think that's one of the reasons why it has particular traction for the far right, is that it box ticks all their current ideological obsessions. And that's a big factor in the way that this is playing out in the media. But you, sir, you talked about, how can we prevent future Israeli and Western violations? And I think it's a great question. I think one of the key things for that is accountability. Part of the reason that we have this is the legitimacy given to the people who enabled and manufactured consent for the war on Iraq and Afghanistan, among other things, who are now, like, absolutely no accountability happened there. They're now, chart-topping podcasters and primetime columnists and, big advisors in Western governments. And I just think if we don't have an accountability, we see it happen again and again and again. There has to be an accountability for what's happened this time around. Otherwise, it will just keep happening. And the other thing is that I actually think it's too late. I think that, you've quoted, all of you have quoted polling that shows that overwhelmingly people understand what's happening despite the distortions of the mainstream media narrative. People clearly understand, are willing to describe it as a genocidal war, are willing to say they want Britain to stop providing arms and other military and intelligence support for Israel. The Democratic Party in the US, its constituency has shifted so dramatically. The narrative on Israel has shattered. It's already too late. And the shift that we're going to see is generational, is that generational people, the people who are currently desperately pushing back in the BBC, within the Guardian, within the CNN, trying to change the narrative, those people are going to rise up the ranks in the media, in politics, and the narrative will change.
Yeah. Dr. Ghazzi, I'm going to come to you next, but given we're running out of time, so I have one last question for the audience, and I'll start with you, but I'll start with the audience first of all. We've spoken a lot about media bias, but I'm curious because the last question I want to ask is where do we go for truth, given that there's so much bias that we've spoken about? Just by show of hands, how many members of the audience still get their information from legacy media, BBC, ITV, Channel 4? Just show of hands. Right. How many go to social media for their Christ? And then other places, like just standing in the street and asking people what's going on. Right. So I want to ask you all, lastly, we've literally got maybe 30 to 45 seconds, maybe a minute each. Given that we've spoken about mainstream media bias and so much untruth, is that a word? Distruth? Mistruth? Untruth. It's my second language, relax. Mistruth. Where should people go to find the truth? Because I'm not particularly convinced social media is the bastion of truth, given I spend so much time on Elon Musk's Twitter. Where would you advise people go to seek the truth?
Well, I think I'm not going to say, oh, like this source is the truth. I think we need to be, and I think probably the people in this room are already an active audience in the sense that to seek news from different sources, and even, you know, you can watch, it's not like you watch the BBC, but with knowledge that you're watching the British government's and the British establishment's take on thing, and you want to be informed about, you know, oh, I wonder, you know, what is the establishment view on this? So perhaps it is not to kind of sit back and expect the truth to come to you, but that is part of being a good citizen at a time when democracy is eroding, because that's also part of the story, is to in fact seek information from different sources, and any response to what we're witnessing, to doing something about it, to stopping the genocide, has to be also collective, has to be in the form of solidarity that is not individual, like the relationship between like a person and a media platform, whatever that is. It's also through institutional bottom-up work that you know, we need to be part of, I think.
Yeah. Faisal, if I can come to you, what can the audience do in terms of seeking truth?
Yeah, I mean, sticking to the media, I think the legacy media still has a vital role to play. And I think, you know, I mentioned Alex Crawford from Sky News, and her and many other journalists are desperate to get access to Gaza. If they were to get access to Gaza, and they've been pushing for it, they've written letters, etc., I think a lot of truth would come from there. I think I mentioned examples when I was speaking that the legacy media have tried, and journalists within the legacy media have tried to bring out the truth, and there's been a pushback against them. But if you follow those people, and if you would give support to those people, I'm sure they would, some of this stuff would come out. And remember, it was the BBC that decided not to show the documentaries. The documentaries do exist. It just depends where they're shown now. So there are filmmakers and journalists who are actively making these things, and the you know, the truth is out there. It's undeniable. And there's many options. I mean, don't just stick to one thing. If you educate yourselves, there's social media and there's all sorts of things. I always think longer form journalism on podcasts, etc., are always a good listen. And just, you know, just be skeptical of everything you sort of read. And I think if your reading is wide enough, you will get to a basic truth about the matter. And the basic truth, I mean, we've given figures in our report, so there's one source.
Yeah, I like that so far. The consensus seems to be view widely, but with a critical eye, which I really like. Rachel, I'm going to change the question lastly for you a little bit. I have heard there's a little bit of a generational divide in these newsrooms, and some of the younger journalists are far more critical and far. Is that true, and how much hope can that give us? Because I also see some young journalists in the audience as well.
I think that is true. Just to echo what Faisal said, though, I think it's definitely true. So that you can see the difference between, especially correspondents, people who've had experience with reporting Israel-Palestine for quite a while, and therefore they know, right? They've been able to analyze You know, Alex Crawford is one of them, but there's plenty of others. They know that when the Israeli army spokesperson says something, it's going to change about 7 times before you get even a close approximation of what really happened. Like, so they know instinctively, you know, what's going on, what the dynamics of the narrative war are, and are able to override that in a way that I think a lot of the time, you know, the Westminster correspondence, you know, and the desks in the UK and the US aren't able to do. So there is, I think there is a difference that, you know, Faisal has alluded to as well, but absolutely generationally, you know. Oh, and also it's a big irony, by the way, that, you know, it's the Israeli media that reports things quite often way ahead of British and US media.
Haaretz has just done the big piece,
Haaretz today has said what was obvious for months. They've actually interviewed Israeli soldiers who've said, "Oh yeah, we just shoot. It's a shooting range at the starving Palestinians who are coming to aid sources, which obviously have been contracted out to this weird amalgamation of US evangelists and private security firms." One of the soldiers said, you know, there's no risk, there's no enemy, there's no threat. One of the soldiers said, oh yeah, we call it a version, it's an Israeli version of red light, green light, which is that game that, you know.
It's Squid Game, yeah.
You might be familiar through Squid Game, but it's a playground game.
Oh,
So they're saying, yeah.
I didn't know that. We never played that.
Well, I didn't either, but I assumed when I saw.
Right,
But,
okay.
anyhow, also with, you know, and early on in the war when, you know, it was obvious that so many people were getting killed, like the scale of Israel's decimation, the scale of Israel's bombardment, it was obvious. A collaboration was going on. And again, it's like, you know, the Israeli-Palestinian Israeli collaboration 972 that actually got to the Israeli army sources. And they explained that, yeah, they raised the permissible number. They completely changed the permissibility ratio of how many innocent civilians can we kill per presumed Hamas target. And, you know, it's not like those things aren't widely available. It's not like when we talked about genocide and intent, it's not like those proclamations are not being made daily by Israeli parliamentarians and Israeli media. It's all out there. It's just that for all the reasons we've discussed, you know, the Western media isn't reporting it. But to answer your question, absolutely yes. I hear this story time and again from people who work at the BBC, who work at The Guardian, and more widely. And you know, you were talking about how they, you know, they have jobs to do and they're working very hard. The other thing is that they'll get targeted, right? So quite often I've heard people say, and this is the younger generation that you're speaking about, you know, if they push back, then they become the difficult one. They become the problem. And obviously we can imagine that that applies more if you're Arab and or Muslim, right? So that's the thing that they're navigating. But absolutely, I see that generational divide, which is why I do think it's shifted and it's only a matter of time. Those people are going to be our future leaders, thinkers, politicians, parliamentarians, and journalists, and it's going to change.
Yeah, and I can't think of a better place to end it there. First of all, join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for their contribution. And a huge thanks to ICJP for organizing the panel. I'm told that the guests will be around, both this panelists and future panelists and speakers as well. So if you have any questions that I didn't get to due to my moderating, you can approach them afterwards. Thank you, guys.